When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went through the city, wailing with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one might enter the king's gate clothed with a sackcloth. In every province, wherever the king's command and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and most of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's maids and her eunuchs came and told her the queen was deeply distressed, she sent garments to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth. But he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what was happening and why. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of the money that Haman had promised to pay to the king's treasures for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther, explain it to her, and charge her to go to the king to make supplication to him and entreat him for her people. Hathach went and told Esther that what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and gave him a message for Mordecai, saying, all the king's servants and all the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law. All alike are to be put to death. Only if the kings hold out to the golden scepter to someone may that person live. I myself have not been called to come to the king for 30 days. When they told Mordecai what Esther had said, Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Then Esther said in reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maids will also fast as you do. After that, I will go to the king, though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered him.
When you came in today, you were given a flame. This is part of our ongoing, I didn't pass out markers. That's what we're doing right now. Our ongoing creative adventure. So on your flame today, write a prayer for people living in marginalized communities, experiencing oppression and injustice. And let us ask for God's peace. Will you join me in prayer? Holy, loving, giving God, bless our words and our thoughts, our reflections, that they may be a blessing to you and all that you love. Amen. Esther is an unusual book. In all 10 chapters, despite what our video suggests, God is not mentioned at all. The Jewish festival of Purim is a celebration that retells the story of Purim, and it tells it with levity and song and costume and a lot of drinking. They boo every time Haman's name comes up, and they have noisemakers. And they celebrate the part that we skip after this, his ultimate demise and destruction of his whole family. It's a little bit of an upsetting story. But think of Purim a little like Rocky Horror Picture Show meets Jewish tradition. We're not going to spend any other time there. I just think it's a fun tradition. Now, each of our characters in our story are a bit more of caricatures than actual people. They are over-the-top versions of what may have been a reality, but that probably didn't really exist in real life. The king is so wrapped up in wanting to only have a good time or good things around him for his life to be a celebration that he doesn't even want people to approach him unless he knows what they're going to say. People can't come near him if they aren't dressed in nice clothing. He seems to sign these edicts without even knowing what they're going to say, just trusting that everyone's going to be okay around him. Haman is just a villain, seeking only for power and finding a way to get to the heart of it without ever actually having to be king, and doing what he could to gain more and more. And Mordecai is seen as only good, having saved the king and doing what he can to save the people, raising his niece when she was orphaned. Esther, up until the very end of our story today, could be seen in what feminist film critics might call a sexy lamp. Did she have any autonomy during the first half of the story? No. Did she make any decisions of her own in the first half of the story? No. If you replaced her with a sexy lamp, would it change the story at all? No. Now, if you start watching movies and inserting this idea, you'll find a lot of your favorite movies, female leads could be a sexy lamp. By the way, it's The Princess Bride. It's terrible. I love it. It's so good. She makes no decisions. It's not really the point either. All right. While living in the palace, Esther seemed to be cut off from the lives of everyone around her, from the lives of her people, from the going-ons of what's happening in the city. She is in the king's bubble of joy and celebration and only good things. I don't know if she was comfortable in her position or if she lived her whole life in a time of fear. Like trans people who fear they don't pass enough and that in their gender and someone will call them out and abuse them. Or stories of people of color who took up jobs and positions that would not be allowed if anyone knew they were actually Black, but they could do it because their skin was so much lighter and they passed. And they all lived in fear of that moment where someone is going to find out who they actually were, who their family was, who their people were really. And I wonder if Esther lived in that fear that someone would find out who her people really were. And I wonder if what we find at the beginning of the story is the distinction between someone who is just trying to survive, who's making decisions to just survive, and someone who makes decisions to thrive in the world. Esther seems just to be surviving in these parts. So what changed Esther's mind? Was it that part where Mordecai says, "You're going to die anyway"? Because that feels a little like bullying, and I don't really like it. Doesn't seem that convincing. Or was it the part where Mordecai says, "Help will come from someplace else if it doesn't come from you"? Which to me is like, cool, Let that happen. No. I think it's the part that that everything in her life had prepared her for this moment, for this place, and for this step. I wonder if Esther thought back to everything in her life and she started to tell the story a little differently. She wasn't just some poor orphan girl who got pushed off on her uncle. She was a survivor. Maybe living with Mordecai had made her smart and cunning and patient. Maybe she had to be the hostess when he had people over, which doesn't sound like a great thing, except the next thing she does is invite the king and Haman to a meal at her home as a way to get him to promise her anything. So she was good at it. I wonder if instead of telling a story of how she was forced into this pageant show as queen, she tells the story of how she was the only one who could help in this position. The stories we tell about our past define how we understand our future. In the time between graduating from seminary and officially being ordained was 10 years. And somewhere in the middle, when I had a seminary degree I was not using, and I was either selling furniture or working for Lowe's, I wondered about the waste of it all. The waste of time, the waste of energy, the waste of money. And I had a friend who looked at me and said, "Nothing is wasted." Would I have liked the process to have gotten there have been easier? Absolutely. Or smoother? Yes. Shorter? Absolutely. But nothing is wasted. Not the retail job you work one holiday season that both drove you crazy and gave you compassion for people. Not the music you took when you were younger that even though you didn't carry it on, gave you a passion for singing. Not the books you read that opened worlds to you that you could have never imagined. Not the relationship you thought would last forever and still broke your heart wide open. That taught you can heal. Now, this isn't to say that your traumas were given to you to prepare you for something else. And you're not getting pain now because it's meant to be the means to an end of something else. But perhaps it gave you insight or experience or compassion. Perhaps it's given you a way to connect in which you wouldn't have otherwise, with people whom you wouldn't have known or given a chance to all along before. For those who are struggling, or those who think that the thing that is happening to them has never happened to anyone else, or keeps them from love. And maybe you have a little something like that in your past too. And tell them it's going to be okay, and walk with them. Perhaps your past has prepared you to care deeply about a world in need. Nicole Nordman, artist, singer, sings of our lives as maps and roads and journeys. What brought you tears in this place? What was important over here? And yes, maybe while you look at the map of your life, there are regrets and there are things that you wish you had done differently. But she goes on that every road brought you here, and every mile matters. here matters. This place matters. One of the Jewish names for God is place, like help will come from some place, or perhaps you are put in this place for a reason. Maybe you are Mordecai, who stands at the city center and proclaims the trouble to prepare the way. Or maybe you're the Mordecai who is a mentor to somebody in a position of power or privilege, or just who is younger than you. Maybe you are Esther, who is able and placed in a position to speak justice and might have an opportunity to do something about it. It'll be clear that most of us aren't going to be Esther, at least not on a grand global scale. Maybe in our little individual spaces, right? Our little city councils, our school boards, our library boards. Most of us, though, most of the time, aren't going to be Esther. And while we ought to proclaim justice and compassion and kindness and love and mercy in the moments when they arrive, it doesn't mean that when we stand in the background waiting, that when we are not Esther, we are just standing in the background waiting for someone else to show up and say the words. When Esther made her first move, the very first intentional decision that she made in our story is that she asked Mordecai, together with the other Jewish people, with her community, that they all fast for 3 days with and for her. And I kind of want to know more about that. For 3 days, this community gathered in prayer and support. They suffered a little for it. For the 3 days, they did not eat or drink. And so their whole focus was on Esther and what Esther had to do, keeping her safe, to keep her reminded of who she is and what had brought her to this place. Now, we speak of the cloud of witnesses as often as those who have gone before us, but sometimes also as those who gather around us and shape our faith, who are still living and nearby. I wonder if Esther felt the weight of their prayers, the weight of their encouragement, and that weight was encouraging and not a burden. The very first thing she asked for was that her community rally around her for support. And it seems to have made a difference. Rebecca Solnit, in her book, Hope and Darkness, she wrote of September 2003 of the World Trade Organization talks in Cancun, of the powerful that was found in the largest and the most influential countries, and how they wielded that power against the smaller nations, of how it was assumed that those smaller nations, the less developed nations, would surrender autonomy without getting anything in return, and without addressing the way agricultural subsidies in the developed world ravaged farming in the least developed ones. She wrote, but thanks to the unanticipated solidarity between the activists, the non-governmental organizations, the impoverished nations, the WTO talks didn't falter. They collapsed spectacularly. One activist emailed us. A woman from Swaziland turned to a colleague of mine and told him that the African countries could not have stood firm against the WTO, the USA, and the EU if it had not been for those activists in and outside of the convention hall. She said that our actions in and outside, our words and our pressure, particularly as they reached the press, gave her and her fellow African nations the strength to take this historic stand. Another activist said, that it was the pressure from the farmers outside that persuaded the nations inside to stand up, to remember that whose lives were at stake, and that they kept Korea, for example, where 1 in 6 families is a farm family, from bargaining away more of its local agriculture. The British Guardian commentator, George Monbiot, wrote, "At Cancun, the weak nations stood up to the most powerful negotiators on earth and were not broken. The lesson they will bring home is that if that is possible, almost anything is." Those gathered crowds made a difference for those who were doing the work inside. And the fasting of Esther's community made a difference in her life, in her going before the king. Nothing is wasted. Not standing up against the powerful, not writing a letter to your congressperson, not standing in solidarity with the poor and the outcast, not showing up to council meetings or school board meetings, not fasting in prayer, not writing a letter, not showing up. Nothing is wasted. And you are being called. You have been placed here in this moment for such a time, and you have been prepared for it. Your past isn't a story that you have just made it through. It is a story of survival and of abundance and of thriving, and it makes you who you are today and has prepared you for what is coming tomorrow. And at any moment, you might be Esther, a voice of change to the powerful, or Mordecai crying out at a rally to rally people, or mentor the next generation, or one of the masses in prayer and fasting, and protesting and being present, a presence or a support. You have been prepared for such a time as this. So, beloveds, what are you going to do with it? Amen. Will you stand as you are able for our hymn?